Single mother at the grocery store asks a billionaire for milk for her baby. And what he does is unbelievable. The cold of the night wasn't the most unbearable thing for Eleanor. The true source of her exhaustion resided in her soul, a deep fatigue that transcended the low temperatures. Every muscle in her body seemed to protest with each movement, and the concrete floor beneath her old sneakers seemed to suck the last drop of her energy. In her arms, a refuge of warmth and innocence, little Clara slept deeply, her sleep slightly disturbed by the gentle rocking. Clara's blonde baby curls, soft as silk, brushed against Elena's chin, a touch that was both a comfort and a constant reminder of her immense responsibility. Elena held her closer, desperately seeking a warmth she couldn't generate herself. The flashing neon sign of the grocery store ahead emerged like a beacon in a storm, a faint promise of temporary relief. As she pushed the automatic door, an electric hum cut through the air, followed by a wave of warm air that, for a brief moment, eased the harshness of the cold in her bones. The familiar aroma of freshly baked bread, mixed with the citrus scent of cleaning products, invaded her senses, an almost painful familiarity, in contrast to the disarray of her life. Eleanor let out a sigh, so soft it was almost lost in the constant buzz of customers. Her eyes, a blue that had once been vibrant but was now clouded by sleep deprivation, scanned the endless shelves. She passed by colorful toys, impeccable children's clothes, and shopping carts overflowing with luxuries she couldn't even dream of. Each item seemed to mock her situation, a cruel reminder of the conveniences that had vanished from her existence. But her focus was clear, unwavering. The dairy aisle. Clara needed milk. It was a primary need, a silent call from the small body that depended entirely on her, and Elena was willing to go to the ends of the earth to satisfy it. With a bottle of whole milk in her hands, cold and heavy, Elena felt the weight of shame settle in. The mental count of the few coins left in her purse was a daily ritual, a painful calculation that always ended with the same conclusion: not enough. She dragged herself to the checkout line. Her shoulders slumped not just from Clara's weight, but from the invisible burden of her complete lack of resources. Each small advance in the line was a beat in her chest, a relentless reminder that the moment of truth was approaching. Cold sweat trickled down her back, a strange contrast to the stuffy heat of the grocery store. When it was finally her turn, Elena's heart was pounding uncontrollably, a frantic drum in her chest. The cashier, a young man with a look of disinterest, began to scan the few items ahead of her. Elena felt the weight of a gaze and turned her head discreetly. A man. Tall, with a quiet elegance that denoted wealth without ostentation, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit. His hair was dark and neatly combed, and his posture was rigid, almost formal. Henry, as she would come to know him. But in that instant, he was just an imposing stranger, a silent judge in her moment of greatest vulnerability. Elena gathered the last drop of courage she had left. Her lips trembled slightly. "She just needs a little milk." Her voice came out in an almost inaudible whisper, laden with desperation and a remnant of wounded pride. "I promise I'll pay when I can." The cashier raised an eyebrow, his indifference replaced by a hint of annoyance. The line behind them seemed to grow exponentially, and Elena could feel the stares, each one a pang of judgment, of impatience, of contempt. It was the personal hell of being visible in her poverty. It was then that a deep, calm voice from behind cut through the tense air. "Put it on my tab." Elena turned abruptly, her eyes meeting his. Henry stood there, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that disarmed her. There was no explicit pity in his gaze, nor a condescending smile, just a deep stillness, a reserve that made his intervention even more enigmatic. The cashier, visibly relieved not to have to deal with a delicate situation, quickly processed the transaction. Henry paid, and with a fluid movement, he took the small bag with the milk and handed it to Elena. All this without an additional word, without prolonged eye contact, just the handover, followed by his quick and silent exit through the automatic door. Elena stood there, the bag with the now warm milk in her hands, feeling strangely empty. The relief of having milk for Clara mixed with a wave of shame that burned inside her. He didn't even wait for a thank you. He just performed the act of charity and disappeared, as if she were a problem he had solved efficiently, without getting involved, without getting contaminated. She left the grocery store, the cold of the night embracing her again, but the warmth of the milk was a reminder of what had just happened, a small point of light in her darkness. Henry settled into the luxurious and silent interior of his car, a model that combined discretion with superior performance. The dark city streets glided under the tires, but his mind was stuck on her image. The pale woman with her messy hair and tired eyes, the protective way she held the blonde baby. The request, simple and painful, for such a basic item. It didn't fit into his meticulously ordered life. Henry was a man of rigid routines, of precise schedules, of a universe built on logic and control. And above all, he was a man accustomed to solitude, a solitude he had carefully cultivated over the years, building high and insurmountable walls around himself. But that scene, so brief and unexpected, had managed to crack the armor of his indifference. During the night, the image of Elena and Clara persisted, a ghost in his mind. Elena's tired blue eyes, the peaceful sleep of the blonde baby, the quiet dignity with which she had made her request. Why did it bother him so much? He had contributed to various causes, donated to several charities, but those donations were abstract, distant, impersonal acts of social responsibility that required no emotional connection. This interaction, however, was visceral, immediate, deeply personal. There was something in Elena's resilience, in the way she held herself up despite everything, that intrigued him. It wasn't pity. Henry hated pity, considered it a sign of weakness, both in the one who felt it and the one who received it. It was a kind of recognition of an indomitable strength, something that he, in his own comfortable and controlled life, had perhaps forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood. The next day dawned grey and damp, the heavy clouds in the sky seeming to reflect Henry's inner turmoil. He followed his morning routine, the daily walk that took him through a small square in the city centre. It was a habit, a way to keep his mind clear and organized before diving into the day's business, and it was there that fate, or chance, put them in his path again. Elena was sitting on a cold park bench, little Clara snuggled in her lap, wrapped in a faded blanket that seemed to barely protect her from the cold and the fine drizzle that was beginning to fall. The two of them, a delicate picture of vulnerability. The little blondes under the grey sky, a melancholic contrast to the harshness of the urban scenery. Clara, despite the cold, had a small smile on her face, while Elena seemed lost in thought, staring into the void with an expression of resignation. Henry stopped. It wasn't a conscious decision, not a calculation. It was a raw impulse, something he hadn't felt in so long he barely recognized it. He was a man of strategies, of long-term plans, of calculated and cold moves. But seeing them there, so small and exposed, so at the mercy of the world, a barrier inside him seemed to give way, to crack under the pressure of an unknown emotion. A strange and powerful urgency took hold of him, a feeling that defied all the logic and control he so cherished. It was as if a fundamental piece of his existence, which he thought was complete, was missing. He approached, and Elena looked up, her eyes widening in recognition. A pale blush rose to her cheeks, mixing with shock and surprise. He wasn't just the benefactor from the night before, but a presence that now seemed to bring with it a promise of something more, something she couldn't name. Henry didn't give her time to apologize or thank him again. "You can't live like this," he said, his voice firmer than he had planned, echoing the conviction that had suddenly overcome him. It wasn't a question, but a statement, an undeniable acknowledgement of reality. "Come with me. There's a limit to how much you can endure." Eleanor stared at him, disbelief marking her tired face. Her blue eyes, once clouded with worry, now shone with a complex mix of fear, distrust, and, despite everything, a small spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. "Where to?" she managed to ask, her voice hoarse and hesitant, almost a whisper the wind threatened to carry away. The instinct for self-preservation, so strong in her, warned her of the dangers of accepting help from a stranger, a man so different from her. "To my house," Henry answered, bluntly, without softening the words, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "I have a room. It's better than the street. Better. You don't deserve this life of uncertainty anymore." He wasn't asking, but declaring. Eleanor's hesitation was almost palpable, a fierce internal battle between the fear of the unknown and the overwhelming urgency of survival. The instinct to protect Clara was the engine of all her actions. The thought of another night in the cold, of another day of uncertainty and humiliation, of seeing Clara's little face marked by deprivation, was simply unbearable. She looked at Clara, at her daughter's fine blonde hair, at her delicate eyelids that moved gently. The prospect of a roof, of a safe place, of warmth and perhaps even regular food was a temptation too powerful to ignore, to reject. She nodded, an almost imperceptible movement, but one that carried the weight of a surrender, of a desperate bet against fate. "Yes," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible, but filled with a new and fragile hope, mixed with a hint of fear. "Please, I thank you." Henry said no more. He just gestured to his car, a gesture that seemed to say, "There's nothing more to discuss." The silence that accompanied them on the drive to Henry's house was a dense mix of tension and strangeness. Eleanor watched the landscape pass by, the city transforming into more opulent neighborhoods, the houses becoming larger and more isolated. Henry's residence, when it finally came into view, was imposing. A solid stone structure with high windows and an air of almost aristocratic distinction. From the outside, it looked like a castle, an impenetrable fortress. Inside, Henry knew. It was a citadel of silence and solitude, a reflection of his own soul. He led them inside, the vastness of the hallways and rooms echoing their few steps. He took them directly to a room on the second floor. It was large, impeccably clean, with a spacious bed covered in white sheets and a wide window overlooking a well-tended and tidy garden. But it was also impersonal, empty of any personal touch, of any human warmth. No photographs, no books, no object that indicated the presence of life. "You can stay here," he said, pointing to the adjacent private bathroom, which looked as sterile as a hospital. "Make yourselves comfortable. There are clean towels in the closet. Anything you need, you can find." With that, he turned and walked away without extending a hand, without offering help with the few faded bags Eleanor carried. He kept his distance, an invisible but palpable barrier. The offer had been made, and the limit, Henry firmly believed, was clear and defined. But as he descended the stairs to the studied quiet of his office, the echo of a soft cry from upstairs, Clara's cry, quickly soothed by Elena's soft, melodic voice, resonated through the silent corridors. And without him knowing, without him being able to predict it, the seed of an unpredictable change had been planted in the heart of his perfectly ordered and solitary world, a seed that promised to blossom and transform everything he knew. Henry's house was a labyrinth of vast rooms and an almost deafening quiet. After they arrived, he simply showed them the room and retreated, leaving Elena and Clara in a space that, although furnished, felt devoid of soul. Elena unpacked her few bags, in reality, an old backpack and a tote bag, and arranged the wrinkled clothes in the enormous wardrobe. Clara, still a bit dazed by the sudden change, but happy to be in a warm, dry place, was placed on the spacious bed, where she soon fell asleep. The peace of the environment, even if cold, was a balm for Elena. It was a roof, a protection. And for that, she felt a silent gratitude, mixed with a twinge of anxiety about the future and what this arrangement meant. The first few days dragged on in an almost sacred silence. Elena cared for Clara with her usual devotion. She fed her, changed her, and rocked her when she whimpered. Everything was done in whispers, in gentle movements, as if she feared breaking the fragile spell of this new, albeit temporary, security. Clara, with her curious blue eyes and blonde hair that was beginning to form little curls, explored the patch of plush carpet in the room, crawling and babbling to her own feet. Elena watched her, an immense love tightening her chest. Her daughter's presence was her anchor, the reason for every effort. Henry, for his part, was a spectral presence. Eleanor would catch glimpses of him, crossing hallways in his office with the door ajar, or coming down the stairs to the kitchen to make coffee. He never spoke to them, other than a brief nod. Their encounters were brief and silent, exchanges of glances that revealed nothing. Elena noticed that he kept a careful distance, almost as if he were afraid of getting too involved. He provided the roof, the security, the food in the refrigerator that Elena could take. But human warmth, interaction, touch, that didn't exist. The house was large, impeccable, but it screamed of a deep loneliness, an echo of the life Henry had led for so long. Elena was not one to sit still. Inactivity for her was a luxury she couldn't afford, and a torture for her mind. With Clara sleeping for most of the day, Eleanor began to look for a way to give back, to not be just a burden. She observed the house. It was clean, no doubt, but something was missing. A touch of life, perhaps. Small details that went unnoticed by someone who had lived there for years. She started with the area around the room they had been given. She made the bed with more care, folded the bathroom towels neatly. Then, she ventured a little further. She noticed that the living room, though elegant, had cushions that could be rearranged, magazines that could be stacked more neatly. Henry, she realized, lived in an environment of order, but without warmth. One day, while Henry was in his office, Eleanor decided she could no longer ignore the fine dust accumulating on some of the living room furniture. She took a damp cloth and, with light, careful movements, began to clean. She didn't want it to seem like she was invading his space, but she felt she needed to do something. With each room she ventured into, she noticed more of the little things that could be tidied up. A vase of dead flowers that could be replaced, curtains that needed an adjustment. She moved like a shadow, attentive to the sounds of the house, always ready to retreat if Henry appeared. It wasn't long before she ventured into the kitchen, a large modern space but strangely unused. The refrigerator was always full, but the pantry, though organized, seemed untouched. Henry clearly didn't cook. Elena, who had always enjoyed cooking, felt a small desire to bring a bit of life to that place. She started with simple dishes, using the ingredients she found. One day she baked a cake, another day a soup. She would leave small portions on the counter without saying anything, without expecting thanks. It was her silent way of making her mark, of transforming some of that coldness. Henry watched from a distance. He wasn't blind. He noticed the subtle changes. The cushions in the living room now looked more inviting. The dead flowers in the vase had been replaced by a modest arrangement of fresh flowers that Elena had bought with the little money she had, or perhaps picked from the garden. The smell of something baking wafted from the kitchen, an aroma he hadn't smelled in his house for years. The dust, which he had never noticed before, was gone. Small details, yes, but they were beginning to change the atmosphere of the house. He didn't interfere. He made no comments. He just watched. From his office, from the stairs, he saw her move through the house, a slender and determined figure, with Clara always nearby. Elena didn't act like a guest, but like someone who wanted to belong, who was trying, in her own quiet way, to create a home. It was a strange dynamic, a ballet of absent presences and unsolicited efforts. Henry had never imagined that his house, his private fortress, could be so invaded by a life so subtle. One day, however, something broke the routine of silence. Henry was in his office, reviewing documents, the soft sound of classical music filling the room. It was a familiar, comforting sound. Suddenly he heard it, a faint but distinct sound, a laugh. It wasn't the restrained laugh of an adult, nor the forced smile of an acquaintance. It was a pure, childish laugh, full of uninhibited joy. Clara's laugh. He stopped. The pen he was holding hovered over the paper. The music, which had previously enveloped him, seemed to fade in his mind. He frowned, confused. Laughter. In his house. The sound repeated, coming from the hallway just outside his office, stronger this time, accompanied by Elena's soft voice. "Oh, Clara, you little rascal!" Henry rose slowly from his chair. He walked to the door, opening it just a crack. In the hallway, Elena was crouched down, laughing, as Clara furiously crawled after a colorful little ball, her chubby little arms moving quickly, a huge smile on her blonde face, her blue eyes shining with contentment. She reached the ball and held it high, letting out another laugh, a crystalline sound that seemed to echo through every corner of the once cold and silent house. Henry stood there, in the crack of the door, watching. It was the first time he had heard Clara's laugh, not a babble, not a cry, but a laugh. A sound he never expected to hear in his house, a sound he had never invited. He paused for a moment. It wasn't anger, nor annoyance. It was something more, a strange sensation, almost a warmth. That sound of pure joy, so alien to his world, had, for a brief moment, broken the ice of his solitary existence. He closed the door slowly, the sound of laughter still reverberating in his mind. The big, empty house. Maybe it wasn't so empty after all. Clara's laugh, that pure and uninhibited sound Henry had heard, seemed to have broken an invisible barrier in the house. In the following days, the absolute silence gave way to a new atmosphere. Elena continued her small rituals of caring for the house, and Henry, while maintaining his usual distance, no longer ignored her so completely. Small gestures emerged, a slight nod when they crossed paths, a "good morning" mumbled by him before leaving for work. The house was still large and silent, but it no longer felt so cold. One evening, something unusual happened. Henry was in the kitchen, making a quick sandwich for dinner as usual. Eleanor, who had just put Clara to sleep, appeared, drawn by the subtle noise. She hesitated at the door, but Henry, to her surprise, said, "There's plenty of food. Do you want to have dinner?" Elena accepted, a little surprised by his initiative. They sat at the kitchen table, a large functional space that was rarely used for shared meals. Henry had made a simple but tasty dish. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the clatter of cutlery and the soft hum of the refrigerator being the only sounds. It was a quiet dinner, without great expectations, but with a subtle tension in the air. Eleanor's curiosity about Henry, and Henry's about the woman who had invaded his world. I wanted to thank you again," Eleanor began, her voice soft. "For everything, for taking us in. I don't know what would have become of us." Henry just nodded, his dark eyes fixed on his plate. "There's no need. You and your daughter needed a place." Eleanor hesitated, but the opportunity seemed right. "I know that. Well, you didn't ask. But I think you deserve to know a little, since you've sheltered us." Henry looked at her, indicating with his gaze that she could continue. "I ran away," Elena began, her voice dropping a tone but maintaining a firmness that surprised Henry. "From a relationship. My ex-husband, he wasn't a good person. At first, he seemed to be always so charming, so attentive. But after Clara was born, things changed. He became possessive, controlled everything. Where I went, who I talked to. He wouldn't let me leave and wouldn't let me work, and the arguments they became more frequent, more violent." Henry continued to eat, but his movements slowed. He listened to her attentively, without interrupting, without judging. "He never got to the point of physically hurting me," Elena clarified. Her voice choked with the memory, but her head held high. But the fear was constant. The psychological violence, the threats. I lived in fear of everything, of every word and of every look. And the worst part, he started directing the same behavior towards Clara. He didn't hit her, but he would yell, threaten her, saying she was a burden, that she was a mistake. And I saw the fear in her eyes, in my daughter's little blue eyes. Elena paused, taking a deep breath, as if reliving every moment. Henry felt a strange tightness in his chest. He, who had always avoided drama and complications, was now hearing a story that was the antithesis of his organized life. That's when I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I would look at Clara and think, I don't want her to grow up in fear. I don't want her to think it's normal to live like this. So, one night, when he was out, I took what I could. I took Clara, and I ran. Literally with the clothes on my back and the few savings he didn't control. Elena's voice was heavy with emotion, but her posture was firm. I preferred the street to seeing my daughter grow up in fear. I preferred uncertainty to the certainty of the terror he imposed on us. I thought if we were far away from him, we would be safe. That the cold of the street would be less painful than the cold of the fear inside our home. Henry listened in absolute silence. He didn't ask questions. He didn't show surprise or shock. He just absorbed every word. He had a life where logic and reason ruled. The idea of living under such terror was completely alien to his existence. But as Elena spoke, he didn't see a fragile victim, asking for pity. He saw a woman who had made a desperate and but brave decision. A woman who had chosen her daughter's freedom and safety above all else. That's why I'm here, Elena concluded, a small sad smile on her face. And that's why I'm so grateful. You gave us a chance to breathe. Henry remained silent for a moment, contemplating his plate. He didn't talk about himself. He didn't have a story of overcoming hardship like hers to tell. His life was a tapestry of successes and self-imposed deprivations, a deliberate choice for solitude. To speak of himself would be to expose a different kind of fragility, one he wasn't ready to reveal. But as he looked at Eleanor, at the way she told her story without self-pity, with a dignity that impressed him, the image of her in his mind changed. She was no longer the desperate woman from the grocery store, nor the silent guest in his house. He saw Elena as someone strong. Yes, very strong, in fact. Someone who had faced a hell and come out of it with her daughter intact, seeking a better, albeit uncertain, future. He saw the courage behind the exhaustion, the determination behind the gentleness, and for the first time, Henry felt a pang of genuine respect for her, respect for a strength he hadn't found in many of the people in his own circle. Elena's confession during that unlikely dinner in the kitchen, a raw narrative about fleeing an abusive relationship and the desperate search for a safe haven for herself and her daughter, resonated with Henry in a way he had never anticipated. He, a man who had spent most of his professional and personal life dealing with indisputable facts and precise numbers, with cold and calculated business strategies, found himself thinking about her courage with surprising frequency. There was no explicit plea for pity, no exaggerated laments or victimhood in her voice, just the naked truth, delivered with a dignity that had deeply impressed him and made him re-evaluate the image he had of her. The figure of Elena in his mind had been rewritten. She was no longer just the desperate woman from the grocery store, the mother in distress, the silent guest. She was undeniably a force, a person of remarkable resilience. And this perception, as subtle as it was, began to untie the knots of his own reserve, those bonds he had tightened over years of self-imposed isolation. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Henry's vast and previously monotonous house began to change. These were not major renovations or structural transformations that altered its austere architecture. It was the little things, the subtleties that seeped into the air, into the smells, and into the spaces themselves. The silence, once an absolute and unquestionable king, now had a soft companion, a delicate melody of life that began to fill the previously empty corners. In the morning, the robust and bitter smell of fresh coffee, brewed by his automatic machine, no longer came alone. It mixed with the sweet and inviting aroma of something baking, perhaps warm toast, perhaps a simple cake, a sweet bread for breakfast that emanated from the kitchen, where Elena had been active since the early hours of the day. And, along with these new smells that danced in the air, there were new sounds, a soundtrack that was previously inconceivable within those walls. Clara's laughter, once a rare event, confined to a moment of pure joy that Henry had witnessed almost by chance, began to be more frequent, more present. A crystalline, clear and uninhibited sound that seemed to find echoes in the farthest corners of the house, breaking the barrier of stillness. And with the laughter came the baby's happy babbles, the squeals of contentment when she reached for a toy, or when Elena made a funny face at her, provoking more giggles. The house, previously a mausoleum of silence and cold order, came to life with these small and adorable childish sounds. Eleanor, with a naturalness that was disarming and seemed to be born from an innate need to create a welcoming environment, adapted to the spacious kitchen. Her steps were light and efficient as she moved between the refrigerator and the stove, and a quiet humming, A soft and almost inaudible lullaby often accompanied the gentle clinking of the utensils she used. It was an old song, a familiar melody she must have heard in her own childhood, now passed on to her daughter, and which Henry, in his office, from the floor above, or while coming down the stairs, could hear, a constant and comforting presence in a previously sterile environment. Clara, the little blonde girl with curious blue eyes, was adapting wonderfully to the new environment. With the safety and space that Henry's house offered, she gained confidence every day. Her movements became firmer, more determined. In a short time, what began as a hesitant crawl on the bedroom carpet turned into a vigorous and exploratory crawl. She tested the limits of the room, then ventured into the hallway, her chubby little arms and legs moving with an adorable determination. The laughter intensified when she dropped a toy, or when Elena picked her up for a tight hug and a shower of kisses. Life pulsed in Clara, a contagious energy that gradually spread through the house, filling the spaces with a light that Henry had forgotten existed. Henry noticed everything. He couldn't help it. Before, his life was a precise clock, each hour dedicated to a specific purpose, each minute meticulously planned. Now he found himself stopping, listening to the sounds, noticing the smells. Instead of going directly to his office after breakfast, as was his unchangeable habit, he would sometimes linger a little longer in the kitchen, watching Elena as she tidied things up or patiently fed Clara. He saw the way Clara stretched her little arms out to Elena, the total and unrestricted trust in her daughter's eyes as she looked at her mother. He saw the affection, the infinite patience, the unquestionable dedication. Gradually, the invisible barrier he had erected around himself began to become more porous, to show signs of wear. Henry began to appear more in the rooms where they were, not invasively, not with the intention of actively participating, but as a more constant, less reclusive presence. Sometimes he would pass through the living room while Elena played with Clara on the floor, and instead of simply moving on without a pause, he would stop for a moment, perhaps to pick up a book or a magazine, but his eyes would invariably fix on the scene before him. Clara, with her contagious energy and disarming innocence, would occasionally notice him and let out a squeal of joy, stretching a chubby arm in his direction, as if inviting him to join in that world of play. Henry still didn't react openly, didn't join the game, but his observation had become longer, the indifference he tried so hard to maintain, harder to sustain. He felt something stir inside him, an emotion that had long been dormant. One day, while Henry was reading a financial newspaper in the living room, immersed in the complexities of the market, Clara, on her journey of exploration, crawled to the tip of his polished shoe. She looked up at him, a toothless grin spreading across her rosy face, and let out a pure, crystalline laugh as she tried to bite, with her toothless gums, the shiny tip of the shoe. Henry, caught completely by surprise by that childish audacity, slowly lowered the newspaper. His eyes met Clara's, blue and full of an innocent curiosity, devoid of any judgment or inhibition. For an instant he hesitated, an internal conflict apparent in his expression. Then something in his face changed, a slight tremor at the corners of his lips, almost imperceptible, that could be interpreted as the beginning of a smile. He moved his foot gently, and Clara, still laughing with delight, crawled a little further, chasing the tip of the shoe as if it were the most fascinating toy in the world. Elena, who was in the kitchen, saw the scene from a distance and felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. It was a small moment, almost insignificant to an outside observer, but one that seemed to carry an enormous weight of meaning for the three of them. The routine of the house, once so monotonous and predictable, gained new layers of complexity and warmth. Every morning, the smell of coffee, once solitary, now mingled with that of fresh bread and other inviting breakfast aromas. Clara's laughter punctuated the hours, marking the rhythm of the day in a way Henry had never imagined. Elena continued to cook with a touch of care, to clean with meticulous attention, to organize with an innate sense of home, transforming the house from an impeccable but lifeless space into an environment that smelled and sounded like a real home. Henry still tried to remain reserved. His movements were calculated, his words few and objective. He was still the man who valued silence and privacy above all else, a man of deeply ingrained habits, but the facade of indifference, once so solid and impenetrable, now showed cracks, small fissures through which light and sound were beginning to penetrate. He found himself reacting to things that would have previously left him impassive, completely oblivious. Clara's crying at night, for example, would have once been just a distant and irrelevant noise, easily ignored in his bubble of isolation. Now, he found himself listening, feeling a pang of concern and a subtle relief when he heard Elena's voice calming her, the sounds of a lullaby he didn't even know existed before. The small messes Clara inevitably made, a toy left in the hallway, a small food stain on the new carpet, would have once been an outrage to his meticulous order, something to be corrected immediately with a stern look. Now he noticed them with a strange tolerance, sometimes even tidying them up without thinking, with an automatic gesture that revealed a new familiarity. The rigidity of his own existence, once an impenetrable armor, was being gradually softened, molded by these new presences, even if he didn't admit, not even to himself, how much he was changing. It was as if the house, once an empty shell, a mere container for his solitary existence, was being slowly filled, not just with people, but with sensations, with emotions, with a tapestry of life that Henry had deliberately exiled from his life for so long. He felt like a privileged observer, almost a silent intruder, witnessing the blossoming of a small family within his walls, a biological and emotional phenomenon that he did not fully understand, but which fascinated him. And, although he resisted this invasion of warmth and life, the resistance was becoming an increasingly heavy burden. Indifference, once second nature, was now a role he found increasingly difficult, almost impossible, to play convincingly. His gestures of detachment became more mechanical, less authentic. One morning, during breakfast, Elena and Henry were alone at the table, the unusual quiet because Clara was still asleep in her room. The sun streamed in through the large kitchen window, illuminating the small wisps of steam rising from the coffee cups and teapot. Elena, preparing toast and pouring juice, felt that the time was right. A deep curiosity, which she had harbored for weeks since they had settled in, finally found its voice. "Do you always live alone?" she asked, her voice soft but direct, without beating around the bush, laden with a gentleness that invited a response. She sat down opposite him, waiting, her blue eyes fixed on his with a rare seriousness. Henry stopped stirring his coffee with the silver spoon. His dark eyes, which had previously observed the house with a strange tolerance and a new curiosity, now fixed on the porcelain cup before him, as if the answers to Elena's question were there, in the dark grounds settling at the bottom. The silence stretched for a few seconds, a time that seemed much longer in the tension of that moment. Elena didn't rush him, didn't press him. She had shared her own pain and her complex story. Now she offered him the same opportunity to do the same, in his own time, without demands. He finally answered, his voice low and a bit hoarse, as if he wasn't used to talking about something so personal, something he had kept so deeply guarded. "Yes." "Always?" There was a finality in his voice, a tone of almost resigned acceptance, a truth he seemed to have assimilated long ago. "I'm used to the solitude." He didn't go into detail. He didn't explain the why of his solitude, didn't offer justifications for his life choices, nor the circumstances that led him to it. Just the simple, almost laconic phrase, which carried the weight of a lifetime of choices and circumstances, of losses perhaps, of built walls. Elena felt his silence as a barrier, but at the same time as a profound confession, a crack into the interior of a complex man. She understood that it wasn't the time, that he wasn't ready, or perhaps never would be, to unravel the intricacies of his own solitude to a stranger, even if that stranger now lived in his house. But instead of feeling rejected by the lack of detail, by the absence of a reciprocal story, Elena felt a pang of genuine understanding. She respected his silence, his space. He didn't need to explain himself. She had tasted the bitter solitude in different forms, each with its own pain, and, Contrary to what one might expect from a woman who depended on his generosity, a small smile appeared on her lips, a smile that was not of pity but of a quiet, almost complicit understanding. Henry, with all his wealth, his imposing house and his seemingly complete world, also carried his own invisible burdens, and the fact that he had said those few words, that he had allowed her to see a glimpse of his most intimate truth, was already, for Eleanor, a huge step. The house was changing, and with it, perhaps, the man who lived in it opening up a millimeter at a time to the life that now surrounded him. Henry's small confession, those few words spoken in a low voice about the solitude that had accompanied him for so long, had an unexpected and profound effect on Elena. Far from creating an insurmountable barrier, as she might have supposed, they seemed to dissolve a little more of the rigid formality that still lingered between them. Elena felt a pang of genuine empathy, realizing that, although their lives were so dramatically different in their external circumstances, loneliness was a feeling they both knew, albeit in different ways and intensities. From that day on, the atmosphere in the house, which had already been transforming into something less austere, became even softer, more permeable to the small gestures of life and affection. Clara, oblivious and happily unaware of the complexities and weights of the adult world, flourished in the safe and unexpectedly welcoming environment that Henry's house offered. Her crawling courts, once a hesitant and experimental movement, became faster, more fearless, and her babbles gained new, clearer, and more articulated intonations. She was in the phase of exploring everything and everyone with her mouth and hands, and her bright blue eyes, full of an insatiable curiosity, did not miss a single detail of the world around her. But what caught the most attention, what seemed to break down the barriers most quickly, was her warm and instantaneous reaction to Henry. Before, she would just watch him with childish curiosity, as if he were just another silent element of the house. Now, however, when he appeared, even if it was just to quickly pass through the living room or the hallway, Clara would let out a squeal of joy, a high-pitched and pure sound that filled the space. Her chubby little arms would stretch out in his direction, an unequivocal invitation. A wide, contagious, toothless grin would spread across her rosy face, and she would babble sounds that, to Elena, seemed like a still-forming Henry, an adorable attempt to pronounce his name. Henry, at first, seemed a bit awkward with so much effusiveness. He didn't know how to react to a child so full of life, to such a spontaneous and uninhibited display of affection, something that was completely alien to his world. However, as the days went by, it was impossible to ignore the contagious joy of the little blonde girl. He began to respond with a nod, then with a slight and almost imperceptible smile. And sometimes, much to Elena's surprise, he would even lean down slightly and let Clara hold his finger with her tiny hand. It was a quick touch, almost imperceptible in its brevity, but it was a touch, a contact that was previously unthinkable. Elena observed these interactions, so subtle and yet so full of meaning, with a comforting warmth spreading through her chest. Clara's presence was disarming Henry in a way that Elena, with all her gratitude and efforts, could never achieve on her own. The baby's pure innocence, her unbridled joy, and her innate ability to love without reservation were an irresistible invitation to connect, a silent challenge to the wall of reserve that Henry had built around himself. Henry still maintained his reserved posture. His movements were controlled, but it was clear that he could no longer feign complete indifference to the little blonde girl who had invaded his world with so much light. He would find himself lingering longer in the living room, watching Clara play on the floor with her few toys, or even stopping at the kitchen door when Elena was there, preparing something, just to watch them. The house, once so silent and devoid of living sensations, now had smells, sounds, and above all, a little creature that filled the spaces with a vibration of life that transformed it. One afternoon, while Clara, exhausted from her explorations, was taking a deep nap in her room, Elena and Henry were in the kitchen. Henry was preparing his afternoon tea, a daily ritual he followed with precision, and Elena was organizing the kitchen cabinets, one of her many self-imposed tasks that she performed with dedication to keep the space impeccable and organized. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable or tense. It was, surprisingly, a silence of familiarity, of companionship, of a strange mutual acceptance. Elena felt it was a good time to bring up an important topic, something that constantly worried her and needed to be addressed. "You know, Henry," she began, her voice a bit more serious and thoughtful, "I need to start looking for a job. I can't stay here forever without contributing in some way, without having my own livelihood." Henry looked up from his teacup, which he held with both hands. His dark eyes fixed on her for a moment, without surprise, but with a thoughtful intensity, as if he were evaluating her every word. He listened to her attentively, as always, giving her space to express herself. "I am immensely grateful for everything, truly," Elena continued, gesturing gently with her hands, searching for the right words to express the depth of her gratitude. "But I need independence. I need to get my own life back, and I need to give Clara a decent future. And I don't want in any way to be a burden to you. We have already abused your generosity and kindness too much." She paused, her blue eyes gazing at the window, where Henry's meticulously cared-for garden bloomed in vibrant colors, a contrast to the uncertainty of her own future. "The problem is, with a baby in my arms, it's hard, very hard. Most places don't hire mothers with young children, especially without daycare or someone reliable to look after them. And I have no one here, no family or friends for support. Do you think I could find something? That someone would give me a chance?" The discouragement was palpable in her voice, an undercurrent of worry, but she tried to sound hopeful, seeking some kind of encouragement. The reality, however, was harsh, and the doors of the job market seemed closed. Henry listened to her until the end, without interruption, allowing her to express all her concerns. He placed the teacup on the table with a deliberate movement and faced her. His expression was serious, but there was no reprimand in his eyes, only deep consideration. "Elena," he said, his voice calm, measured, unhurried, as if each word was chosen with care. It was the first time he had spoken her name with such clarity, with such intentionality and warmth. The sound of her name coming from him in that way had a strange and comforting effect on Elena, a sign of a deepening connection. "Don't be in a hurry," Henry repeated, the phrase sounding more like a statement of permission than advice. His voice, normally so distant, now carried a tone of unexpected softness. "You and Clara have just been through a lot. A huge transition. You need time to stabilize, to heal, to take a deep breath. This house is large, Elena. There is plenty of room for you. There is absolutely no pressure for you to leave or to rush to find something." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with a frankness that surprised her. "Stay as long as you need. Don't worry about it now. Just settle in. Let Clara grow a little more here, in safety and peace. She is happy here, and that's what matters. You are safe here." The last words were spoken with a firmness that left no doubt about his conviction. Elena looked at him, completely surprised. She had expected encouragement to look for a job, perhaps an offer to help with the search, but never such a generous, unconditional permission to stay, without deadlines or conditions. The proposal was an immense relief, a weight lifted from her shoulders, but it also made her question Henry's motivation. He was so reserved, so averse to commitments and any kind of intrusion into his personal life. Why this openness? Why this unexpected generosity? "But why?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper, seeking to understand what moved him. "Why so much kindness, one Henry?" Henry looked at her for a moment, and for the first time, Elena saw a glimpse of something more in his dark eyes. It wasn't just the usual calmness, but something that seemed to mix a certain hesitation with a hint of something deep, almost vulnerable. He seemed to weigh his words carefully before answering, "Because this house, it was empty, deeply empty, and now it has a presence. You have brought life to it." Those simple words touched Elena deeply, resonating in her heart in an unexpected way. Henry's house, once a monument to silence and cold order, had truly changed. The smells of fresh food, childish laughter echoing through the corridors, Elena's soft singing as she cooked. The presence. The house was no longer just walls and luxurious furniture. It pulsed with a life, an energy that Henry, in his self-imposed solitude, had inadvertently invited within his walls. Eleanor felt a mix of emotions inside her. The gratitude was immense, overwhelming. The relief of not having to face the hostile world with a baby in her arms, with every door that closed in her face, was an invaluable gift. She nodded, a small smile appearing on her face, an expression of pure acceptance. "Thank you, Henry. Truly. I don't know how to repay all of this." He just nodded, already back to stirring his tea, as if the matter was closed and he wanted no more discussion about it. But the moment had settled between them, a new layer of understanding and mutual acceptance. The house now had a presence, yes, and that presence was theirs, Clara's and Eleanor's. That vast and previously sterile space, filled only by the echo of Henry's loneliness, was now a home under construction. It wasn't love yet, not in the traditional or romantic way that Elena knew or expected, but it was care, a silent, discreet, almost invisible, but real, palpable, and undeniable care. It was proof that, even in the most reserved and protected lives, affection could find a crack to enter without asking for permission and transform everything it touched. And, in a way, it was a beginning for Henry too. Even if he still didn't know what it meant for the future of his own existence, Henry's generous permission for Elena and Clara to stay in the house for as long as they needed brought immense relief, but also a burden. The gratitude was deep, but the idea of depending indefinitely on someone else's charity, however well-intentioned, ate away at Elena from the inside. Although the safety and comfort were undeniable, and Clara was visibly happier and more developed, the need for her financial independence continued to be a burning flame in her chest. She needed to prove to herself, and perhaps to Henry, that she was not a burden, that she could get back on her feet. Thus, despite Henry's reassuring words, Elena decided she couldn't stand still. When Clara reached a stage where her naps were longer and more regular, Elena began to plan. She searched for job ads, printed out makeshift resumes, and on carefully chosen mornings, when the baby's routine allowed, she went out. She would leave a brief note for Henry, informing him that she would be out for a few hours, and ensure that Clara was either sleeping or entertained with toys in the room, well stocked with milk and diapers, under the discreet but attentive care of the house staff, instructed by Henry for any emergency needs. With each outing, Eleanor felt a mix of hope and apprehension. The hope of finding a job, anything that would allow her to start over, and the apprehension, not only because of the inherent difficulties of job hunting in her situation, but also because of the constant fear, a chill down her spine, that the past might catch up with her. The city was large, but the world, she knew, could be cruel and small. On that particular morning, the sun was shining brightly, but Elena's heart was heavy. Once again, the doors were closing. A coffee shop denied her a position for lack of recent experience. A department store turned her away for having a baby with no one to leave her with. Discouragement tightened its grip. As she walked back to Henry's house, her steps were slow, dragging. She replayed the conversations, the polite excuses, the feeling of invisibility. Lost in her thoughts, Elena didn't notice the man standing on the corner of the busy street, his eyes fixed on her. He looked different from what she remembered, thinner, with a patchy beard and bloodshot eyes, but the recognition was immediate and brutal. An electric shock ran through her body, paralyzing her. It was him, the past Lucas, her ex-husband. The air seemed to thin in her lungs, the blood in her veins turned to ice. All the fears she had tried to bury, all the peace she had tried to build, crumbled in an instant. She felt panic rise in her throat, a silent scream that threatened to suffocate her. He saw her, and a predatory smile spread across his lips. A smile she knew so well, that always preceded an explosion of anger, a wave of control. "Well, look who I found." His voice, low and drawling, carried a tone of disguised threat. He took a step toward her. "The runaway. I thought I'd never see you again." Eleanor instinctively recoiled, her body trembling. Her first instinct was to run, to flee as fast as possible, but her feet seemed glued to the ground. "Lucas, leave me alone," she managed to stammer, her voice hoarse, almost inaudible. He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in her mind. "Leave you alone after everything you did, running away with my daughter." The emphasis on "my" hit her like a punch to the gut. The fear for Clara, even though she was safe in Henry's house, was overwhelming. "Clara is not yours, Lucas. She's my daughter," Elena retorted, finding a strength she didn't know she had, driven by maternal instinct. He moved closer, his face twisting into a familiar rage. "She's my legacy, and you're coming back home, where you belong. I'll show you what happens when someone defies me." Elena's panic reached a point of no return. Fear was clouding her judgment, but her body now knew what to do. She turned abruptly and started running without looking back, without thinking where she was going, just running. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, but she didn't stop. The streets became a blur. The city sounds turned into a distant hum. All that mattered was to escape. To escape from Lucas. To escape the past that had materialized before her. She ran until her feet ached, until exhaustion overcame her. She only stopped when she saw the familiarity of Henry's street, the imposing house that now represented the only safety she knew. She rushed inside, with the key Henry had given her, her hands shaking so much she could barely fit it into the lock. As soon as the door closed behind her, locked with as many turns as she could manage, she slid to the floor, her body trembling, her breath ragged, tears streaming uncontrollably down her face. The sounds of the house, once so welcoming, now seemed strange. The silence, which she had learned to love, was now frightening. She needed Clara, desperately. She ran up the stairs, ignoring the pain in her muscles. She found Clara awake in the room, crawling and playing. Elena picked her up, holding her tight, inhaling her daughter's baby scent, the only real and good thing amidst the chaos that had invaded her. With Clara still in her arms, Elena collapsed onto the bed. The tears came with full force, uncontrollable, terrifying. She sobbed convulsively, the fear paralyzing her, the horror of having met Lucas again, the certainty that he would pursue her. How did he find her? Would he follow her here? The security she thought she had found was an illusion. She was lost again, and worse, Clara was in danger too. The tears soaked her daughter's blonde curls, who looked at her with her big blue eyes, not understanding her mother's despair. Henry was in his office, immersed in a pile of reports. The day had been particularly demanding, and he appreciated the silence and order that surrounded him. That's when he heard it. A muffled but unmistakable sound. A cry, not Clara's cry, but an adult's. A desperate wail that echoed through the corridors, breaking the serenity of the house. He frowned. Concerned, he got up and went to the door of his office. He opened it. The sound was coming from upstairs, from Elena's room. Henry didn't hesitate. He walked quickly there. The door was ajar. He peeked in. The scene before him was heartbreaking. Elena was sitting on the floor, leaning against the bed with Clara in her lap, crying convulsively. Her face was red and swollen, her hair disheveled, and her shoulders were shaking. Clara, frightened, clung to her mother, her blue eyes wide. Henry felt a knot form in his stomach. He had never seen her so helpless. All the strength he had admired in her seemed to have vanished, replaced by a deep terror. He took a deep breath, trying to control the anger that was beginning to rise within him, an anger for something he didn't yet understand, but which he instinctively knew was serious. He entered the room, closing the door softly behind him. He walked over to Elena and knelt in front of her, at her eye level. Elena looked up, her eyes swollen, and the terror in her expression was palpable. "Elena," he said, his voice firm, but with a calmness that surprised even himself. He reached out and touched her shoulder, a simple gesture, but one that conveyed an unexpected strength. "What happened?" "You're safe here." She couldn't speak at first, just shook her head, tears streaming down. Henry waited patiently, keeping his touch firm. Finally, between sobs, she managed to say, He found me. Lucas. He was on the street. He saw me. Henry. He knows where I am." The mention of Lucas's name, the abusive ex-husband she had fled from, ignited a spark of understanding and fury in Henry. He had heard her story, but now, seeing the terror on Elena's face, the fragility of Clara in her arms, turned the narrative into a cruel and immediate reality. The anger he had felt before intensified, but he controlled it. What Elena needed now was security, not his anger. He squeezed her shoulder gently. "He's not going to hurt you, or Clara. Not here." His voice was low, but it carried an unshakable conviction. "You're safe here. I'll take care of you now." The words were not a request, nor an empty promise. They were a declaration, an order. His house, his sanctuary, would become their sanctuary. Elena looked into his eyes, the intensity of his statement piercing the veil of her panic. For the first time since she had fled from Lucas, for the first time in her entire life perhaps, Elena felt truly protected. It wasn't just the warmth of the words, but the silent strength that emanated from Henry, the conviction in his gaze. It was as if an invisible armor enveloped her, a shield against the cruel world that had tried to destroy her. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, feeling an overwhelming relief. Later, Clara was sleeping soundly in her crib, lulled by her mother's exhausted sobs and Henry's firm presence. In the kitchen, Henry and Elena were having tea. The silence, once so heavy with pain and fear, was now filled with a different kind of quiet, one that was shared. Henry's cup steamed in his hands, and Elena, still a little pale, held her own cup, warming her hands. Henry looked at her, his voice low and sincere, breaking the silence unexpectedly. "You think I was the one who saved you, Elena?" Elena looked up, surprised by the statement. She firmly believed that, yes, he had saved them. He continued, his dark eyes fixed on her, his voice even softer and more revealing. "But it was you who saved me, without you knowing it." Elena stared at him, not understanding. Henry was the benefactor, the rich man. How could she have saved him? "I've never loved anyone," Henry confessed, the words coming out with visible difficulty, as if they had been stuck in his throat for too long. It was a rare admission, a glimpse into his soul that he had kept so well guarded. "My life was organized, but empty. I was used to the solitude. I cultivated it. I thought it was all I needed." He paused, a distant look in his eyes, perhaps reminiscing about a life of self-imposed isolation. Then he looked at her again, and Elena saw the truth in his eyes, a depth she had never noticed before. "But now," he continued, his voice almost a whisper, laden with an emotion he couldn't name, but that was undeniable. "Fanakines, I can't see my life without you, without Clara's laughter, without your presence in the house, without the way you transformed it. You brought something I didn't know was missing, something I didn't even know I needed." Elena felt a shock. His words, so unexpected, hit her like a gentle but powerful wave. All her uncertainties, all her doubts about being a burden, dissipated in that instant. He wasn't being charitable out of obligation. He was talking about a need, a profound discovery. She reached her trembling hand across the table and held his. There were no promises of romantic love, no grandiose declarations of a future. There was only the real presence. The presence of two souls marked by loneliness and pain, who had somehow found each other in an unlikely home. Henry's words, his unexpected vulnerability, had sealed something between them. It wasn't love in the classic sense, but it was something deeper, more fundamental. It was care. It was an unbreakable connection, built on the foundation of gratitude, respect, and a revelation that changed everything. It was the certainty that they belonged, somehow, to each other, in that space that was once empty, and now, finally, pulsed with life. The night of Henry's confession in the kitchen marked a turning point, a point of no return in the lives that were intertwining under his imposing roof. His words, "You saved me. I can't see my life without you anymore," echoed in Elena's mind long after silence once again filled the space. The vulnerability of a man who seemed so unshakable, so built on logic and reserve, was a powerful, almost shocking revelation. He, the man who took them off the street, the benefactor in his silent armor, was, by his own admission, equally rescued by their presence. This exchange of truths, devoid of formalities or the loaded expectations of traditional romance, created an invisible but unbreakable bridge between them, a connection of souls that surpassed any social or material distinction. Elena felt safer than ever before, not only physically, protected from the inclemencies of the world and the threat of her past, but emotionally, welcomed into a space of acceptance. The shadow of Lucas, though still latent in her thoughts, seemed less terrifying under Henry's silent and firm protection. The days that followed this revelation were woven with a new understanding, a delicate tapestry of mutual acceptance. The house, once a place of temporary refuge, a safe harbor granted by charity, took on the air of a home that was being built piece by piece, moment by moment, with each of Clara's laughs and each of Eleanor's gentle touches. The presence of the blonde baby, with her curious blue eyes and contagious energy, was the light that guided this transformation, and Elena, with her gentle touch on the details and her soft laughter that mingled with her daughter's, was the invisible architect of this new reality. Henry, for his part, was more present, not just physically, sharing the same rooms of the house, but in a more genuine, more engaged way. The glances they exchanged were longer, more laden with meaning, no longer just discreet observations, but windows to a growing understanding. Small gestures, once unthinkable for such a reserved man, became common, part of his new routine: a glass of water offered without being asked, a colorful toy of Clara's that Henry would pick up from the floor unsolicited, a brief sharing of the day's news or observations about the garden. It was a clear spring morning, the gentle sun of the season flooding Henry's meticulously cared-for garden, turning it into an oasis of vibrant green and budding flowers that opened into colorful promises. Henry, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable a short time ago, had allowed Elena to take Clara to play on the grass for the first time. The grass, a velvety green carpet, seemed inviting under the baby's curious feet. Clara, with her inexhaustible energy and her blonde curls that bounced happily with every movement, crawled with enthusiasm. She explored the white daisies that sprouted here and there, let out squeals of joy at the butterflies that flew over the newly opened flowers, and laughed uninhibitedly when she felt the gentle breeze on her face, a small manifestation of pure happiness. Her pure and crystalline laughter filled the air, a sound that was once so rare, almost non-existent, in the studied quiet of that garden. Henry and Eleanor watched the scene from a respectful distance, sitting on a stone bench shaded by an old tree whose branches stretched out like protective arms. The silence that hung between them was not one of discomfort or strangeness, but of contemplation, of a deep and newfound peace that enveloped them both. Both of their eyes were fixed on Clara, a small figure of pure joy and innocence, who represented both the hope and the future that was somehow being drawn for the three of them. Eleanor, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the smell of damp earth and flowers, sighed softly, a sigh that was a mix of relief and gratitude. Henry, who had spent the last few days pondering his own words, the complex feelings they revealed, and the unexpected turn his life had taken, broke the silence, his voice low and a bit hesitant, as if he were testing the ground of a new and unknown emotion. "Have you ever thought about staying, Elena?" The question, so direct and yet so full of implications, caught Elena completely by surprise. She turned her head to face him, her blue eyes meeting his. There was an unusual seriousness in his gaze, a depth she had never seen before, a sincerity that shone through. She had expected him to eventually talk about the future, about job plans or the next step for them, perhaps in a more organized and practical way, but not a question like this, so personal, so laden with a veiled promise of permanence. Henry continued, his voice gaining a little more firmness, as if each word was important, each carrying the weight of a monumental decision he had made in his lonely heart. He extended a hand in an open gesture, not to touch her, but to emphasize the breadth of his invitation, not as a guest, Elena, not as someone passing through, but as a part of this, as a part of me, as a part of my life. The last words were spoken with an intensity that struck her deeply, Those words hit Elena with a gentle but undeniably powerful force. They were an invitation that went far beyond mere physical permanence in the house. It was an invitation to the future, to a shared life, to build something together, something that would transcend help and gratitude. Elena's heart began to beat faster, a racing rhythm that betrayed the depth of her emotion. She looked again at Clara, who was now trying, with small, uncoordinated hands, to catch a dry leaf that danced in the wind. The image of her daughter, so happy and free in that garden, reinforced the magnitude of Henry's unexpected proposal, a proposal that promised the stability she had always dreamed of for Clara. A lump formed in Elena's throat, momentarily choking her words. She thought about her life before Henry, about the echoes of violence, the constant fear, the cold and merciless street. She thought about the journey of hopelessness that had brought them there, an odyssey of deprivation and danger, and she thought about the strange, but solid, security she found with Henry, a man who, in his own solitude, had opened not only his house, but his heart in a way she could never have imagined, that she would never have dared to expect. That silent care, those demonstrations of affection, had become the pillars of her new existence. She turned to Henry again, her eyes welling with emotion, but with a gentle smile, a mix of relief and happiness. "We never had anything, Henry," Elena replied, her voice a little choked with emotion but full of a deep and unquestionable truth. She let the words hang in the air for a moment so that the weight of those past experiences would be understood. No place to call our own, no lasting security, no solid foundation. Just the constant fear and the uncertainty of each new day. She paused for a moment, her gaze returning to Clara, who was now laughing as she crawled towards a colorful flower, the very personification of innocence and joy. "But here, Henry," she continued, her voice firmer now, full of conviction and a new hope. "Here, with you and with Clara, here we have everything. A real home, peace, a security I never knew, and the hope of a future that seemed impossible." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of all her experiences. Henry's smile broadened, a genuine and warm smile that rarely appeared on his face, but which now lit up his dark eyes with a light Elena had never seen. Elena's words were a confirmation of what he already felt in his heart, of what he had realized in the last few days of living together. The decision to stay was not just a response to his proposal, but a mutual recognition that they had found something valuable and irreplaceable in each other, a missing piece in their individual lives. There was no formal marriage proposal, no shiny ring, no grand and romantic declarations of passionate love. There was something more fundamental, more rooted, a mutual acceptance, a choice to build a life together, based on care, respect, and a connection that deepened with each day, solidifying into an invisible foundation. The days that followed this conversation in the garden were filled with a new lightness, a quiet and happy expectation that permeated every corner of the house. Eleanor felt more at ease than ever. The anxiety of being a burden had disappeared, and Henry's presence was now a constant source of comfort and no longer of reserve. The house, with its aromas of homemade food, Clara's contagious laughter, and the shared moments of silence, was consolidating itself as the home they had found together, a home forged in unexpected circumstances. A few days after the decisive conversation in the garden, Elena noticed something different in the house. The sounds of hammering and sawing, soft but persistent, came from one of the guest rooms upstairs, a room that had always been closed and untouched, an empty and silent space. Curious, but respecting Henry's privacy, she didn't ask, not wanting to seem nosy, until one day Henry called her, his voice with a slightly different tone, one she couldn't identify. "Elena," he said, his voice a little softer than usual, an unusual gleam in his dark eyes, almost a spark of restrained excitement. "I'd like to show you something. Come with me." He led her to the guest room, which was previously a blank canvas. Upon opening the door, Elena stopped abruptly, breathless. The room, once impersonal and empty, was completely transformed. The walls had been painted in soft shades of cream and light blue, colors that evoked calm and serenity, perfect for a child's environment. In the center, there was a beautiful and sturdy wooden crib, newly assembled, with white sheets and a colorful mobile of teddy bears that spun gently above it, dancing in the air. A small, functional dresser and a soft armchair completed the room, creating a space that was undeniably as a baby's room. A delicately installed shelf on the wall displayed a small collection of stuffed toys, some children's books with colorful covers, and a small activity mat on the floor, inviting Clara's small movements. Every detail, from the choice of colors on the walls to the delicately arranged objects, spoke of affection, of planning, of a dedication and care that Elena did not expect, that caught her by surprise. It was a room not for guests, but for a child, made with a love that surpassed all expectations. Elena brought her hands to her mouth, her blue eyes welling with tears that fought not to fall. The emotion was overwhelming, intense, almost suffocating. It was tangible proof of Henry's acceptance, not just of them in his house as guests, but of Clara in his life, as a permanent part, an irreplaceable presence. "Sal, you did this for her," she managed to whisper as her voice choked, struggling to hold back the tears that threatened to burst forth. Henry looked at her, and a tender, almost imperceptible smile, but one that overflowed with warmth, crossed his lips. His dark eyes, once so reserved and distant, now conveyed a sweetness and a vulnerability that Elena had never seen before, a window to a completely new Henry. "For her, yes," he replied, his voice low but firm, full of conviction. Then he took a step forward, approaching her, and continued, the words laden with a profound meaning that went far beyond what was said. "But also for you, for us, so that you know that this is your place, that this is our home. For good." In that instant, Elena's tears flowed freely, warm and abundant. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of a joy and gratitude so intense that it made her tremble from head to toe. She felt a sense of belonging that she had never experienced before in her life, a feeling of having finally found her safe harbor. There was no more uncertainty, no more painful need to search for a place in the world for herself and Clara. That place was here, with Henry and Clara, in the house that now breathed life. Shortly after, Clara was brought to her new room. Her blue eyes widened with curiosity and surprise at the new colors, the crib that was all hers, the toys arranged with care. With a squeal of pure happiness and a joyful babble, she quickly crawled to the activity mat, picked up a soft teddy bear, and let out a contagious laugh that echoed through the newly decorated room, filling it with childish joy. She was home, in her own space. Henry watched the scene, standing at the door, his arms crossed, a distant yet deeply present look in his eyes. Eleanor saw him, and he didn't notice that she was watching him intently. His lips trembled slightly, and she swore she saw a silent tear run down his face, quickly wiped away by him before anyone, especially Elena, could notice. He didn't say a word, but the emotion on his face, the way he watched Clara, his little guest now part of the family, was more eloquent than any speech, more powerful than any verbal declaration. It was the emotion of a man who had found, in the laughter of a blonde child, and the resilient presence of a strong woman, a purpose, a home, a life that he didn't know he was missing, that he didn't even know existed. The house, once large and empty, was finally complete, filled with the echo of a happiness that seemed destined to last. The house breathed. It was a slow, deep breath of one who had finally found its natural rhythm. The air carried familiar aromas, the warm bread Elena prepared every morning, the strong coffee Henry enjoyed, and a sweet scent that only small children can bring, that smell of purity and crystalline laughter. It was 6 in the morning when Clara woke up, as usual, with her messy blonde curls and her still sleepy blue eyes. But instead of a morning cry, she let out a happy little babble, as if she knew something special awaited her. From her room, painted with such care, came the soft sounds of her attempts to speak, little mamamas and da-da-das that echoed through the previously silent corridors. Eleanor appeared at the door, her loose hair falling over her shoulders, a lazy smile still marked by sleep. "Good morning, my princess," she murmured, picking Clara up. The baby snuggled against her mother's chest, but her curious eyes were already looking for something more, or rather, someone else. In the kitchen, Henry stood by the window, watching the garden awaken with the golden morning light. He held a cup of coffee, still wearing the dress shirt from the previous day but with his tie undone and his sleeves rolled up. When he heard Elena's footsteps coming down the stairs, he turned instinctively. Clara saw him first. A squeal of pure joy escaped her rosy lips, and she stretched her little arms toward him, babbling sounds that seemed like an adorable attempt to say, "Henry." It was impossible to resist that effusiveness, that genuine joy that knew no reservations. Henry approached, extending his arms. Elena, without hesitation, passed Clara to him. It was a gesture that had become natural in recent weeks, but still carried a deep, emotional weight. When Clara nestled against Henry's chest, her little fingers tangling in his shirt, something quieted in the house, as if all the pieces of a complex puzzle had finally found their places. "She loves you," Eleanor said softly, watching the scene as she began to prepare breakfast. It wasn't a casual observation, but a profound realization. Clara not only felt safe with Henry, she had completely adopted him, in the way only small children can, without questions, just with an open heart. Henry looked at the baby in his arms, his dark eyes reflecting a tenderness he didn't know he possessed. Clara played with the buttons on his shirt, making those happy little sounds that had become the soundtrack to his days. "I never thought it would be possible," he murmured, more to himself. Breakfast was served at the kitchen table, which had become the center of the house. Eleanor brought fresh bread, homemade jam, fruit cut into small pieces for Clara. Henry watched, still holding the baby, as she organized everything with a natural ease. There was no hurry, no tension, just the calm of an ordinary morning in an ordinary family. When they sat down to eat, Clara on Henry's lap, a comfortable silence hung between them. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled, that spoke for itself. Eleanor chewed on a piece of toast, watching Henry teach Clara how to hold a small piece of banana. His patience was infinite, his dedication evident. "Do you think this is love?" Elena asked suddenly, the question leaving her lips before she even had time to think. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but filled with genuine curiosity. She wasn't referring only to what existed between the two of them, but to the whole picture, the house that breathed, the child that united them, the feeling of completeness that neither of them had ever experienced before. Henry paused, the piece of banana still in his hands, Clara looking at him with expectation. He pondered the question for a long moment, his gaze traveling over Elena's face, then down to Clara, who was now playing with his undone tie. "I don't know what it's called," he finally replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I just know that. Now I know how to live." The words hung in the morning air, simple but charged with deep truth. It wasn't a grand declaration of passion, nor eternal promises. It was something more fundamental, the recognition that life, once just a succession of organized and empty days, now had color, sound, meaning. Clara, oblivious to the depth of the moment, let out a musical laugh and grabbed Henry's tie, bringing it to her mouth as if it were the most fascinating toy in the world. The sound of her joy broke the seriousness of the moment, and both Elena and Henry laughed, at first softly, then more openly, until the kitchen was filled with the sound of 3 different laughs, blending in perfect harmony. That was it. A home had been formed, not through careful plans or rational decisions, nor through contracts or formal promises, just through love, that complex feeling that had found its way through the most well-built defenses and the deepest fears. Clara continued to laugh between the two of them, as if she knew she was responsible for all that magic, for all that transformation. And maybe she did. After all, love has many forms, and sometimes it arrives through the blue eyes of a child who knows no impossibilities. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like, because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.